So welcome back, everyone, from the break. I'm sorry about this little delay here. We are entering our final plenary panel dialogue for our 3 days together around education as relating. And Alex, are we recording?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So education is relating, and we've been just having a wonderful time these last 3 days connecting and meeting new people, hearing about a lot of different practices, just lots of exploration and learning about innovations around the world. And this panel is going to be doing some reflecting on what's happened the last couple days and where we go from here. So I would like to bring Sheila, who is going to be our host for this panel. Sheila Mcnamee is co-founder of the Taos Institute. She is also vice president of the Taos Institute. She is also professor emerita of communications at the University of New Hampshire. And she's a visiting professor at many different universities around the world. Her work has focused on dialogic transformation within a variety of social and institutional contexts. Sheila actively engages in constructionist practices in a variety of ways, bringing communities of participants with diametrically opposing views together to create livable futures. So really, how do we come together to create our futures together? So she lectures and consults regularly, both nationally and internationally. She is author of many important books in this field and lots of different articles on social construction, relational theory and practice, and relational responsibility. So Sheila, thank you for hosting this final conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to you as you introduce your guests for this conversation.
Thank you, Dawn. It's actually an honor and a pleasure to be able to host this final plenary. And I want to welcome you all. Unfortunately, I've not been able to be present during most of this conference for personal reasons. So for me, this closing plenary is a way for me to catch up and hear about the innovations, the commitments, and the inspiration that has emerged and that we can carry forward. Let me pause to introduce the 4 contributors to the plenary who are going to share their views on what's transpired over our time together, and as well as their thoughts about shaping the future of education. So first, we have Tamara Richter London from Mexico. Tamara has been teaching high school students for the last 5 years, which means that she went through, as probably most of us did, the transition from online learning back to in-person learning, and sometimes back and forth during the pandemic. She's involved in community building with Jewish teens and is also finishing her PhD, where her focus is on relational school management using Xavier Academy as a case study. She's interested in educational policy, and she practices locally and researches globally. Welcome, Tamara. Next, we have Luc Schoenbacher from the Netherlands, who's been working in education for over 40 years. The relational perspective has always been a constant thread in his work and his life, and his motto, he tells me, is connecting people young and old, creating hopeful futures together, and finding solutions. After various roles as a kindergarten teacher, a headmaster, a school advisor, a coordinator, a trainer, a coach, Luc now works for his own company called Appreciative Change Works, as well as at a teacher training program in the south of the Netherlands, where he has taken on this new position as a research lecturer, and he's partnering with the Taos Institute to set up a powerful way to train teachers to think about research in really life-changing ways, to think about it as a daily form of practice. There's a lot more to be said about all the participants in today's final plenary, so I hope you'll connect with them. Next is Thalia Dragonis from Greece. She is Emerita Professor of Social Psychology at the University of Athens and is a member of the Taos Institute's Associates Council. She is co-editor of the Taos World Share book, Education as Social Construction. And she was the editor of the education section of the recently published Handbook of Social Constructionist Practice. She joins this conversation from the perspective of educating minorities and refugees. Her research on this topic takes up issues of diversity and identity. And finally is Saliha Baba from New York by way of India and many other places. Saliha is Associate Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Mercy College in New York. She's a long-term Taos associate and advisory board member who's created a number of projects with Taos. And she's involved in international training and teaching of professionals, specifically through the International Certificate Program in Collaborative and Dialogic Practices. And she also focuses on online spaces and higher education, tying in inclusive pedagogies. So welcome to all of you. Before I invite your reflections, I just wanted to say a few words. As I think about education as relating, I feel both hopeful and overwhelmed, and I'm sure we all do have that feeling of being overwhelmed. As an educator for the past 40 years, I know firsthand that relational processes in education are more important than any content prescribed by the curriculum. One of the people whose writing on education I really like is Geert Biesta, and he says, education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it. My question is, how do we cultivate that sensibility in education? How do we break away from the view of education as work, drudgery, as required, as necessary to get a job, and yet disassociated from everyday life? To educate is to summon someone as a person who can already think and act, and demand that they make use of those faculties. This morning we heard from a handful of voices of youth about their desire to be part of the process, to be listened to. In Leo's words, to never have a student's curiosity taken for granted, and to take the time to cultivate rich learning environments that are marked by difference, not by similarity, not by uniformity. In order to invite everyone to share their thinking and their actions in the educational context, we need to shift from this competitive view of education, student against student, teacher against teacher, school against school, community against community, nation against nation. We need a humanizing view. We need to shift from that competition to a humanizing view of education, a view that acknowledges that our best efforts are collaborative, not competitive. If we can work together, we can create relational processes that are inviting, participatory, and engaging, connected to the lives of those we are educating. We can inspire creativity to solve the largest global problems we confront: climate, economic problems, immigration, and on and on. My hope is that this conference has stirred the desire to move relational processes in education from positions of a few programs or practices that sit alongside traditional education, and instead embrace relational processes as the only viable form of education. So let me invite our 4 speakers to share first their reflections on this gathering. Tamara, can I ask you to give us your sort of high-level reflection?
Thank you, Sheila. That was a great opening. I love Biesta, one of my favorites. Well, what I enjoyed about this conference is that I was able to hear from the practice. I heard from the practice of folk schools in Denmark, alternative school in the States, from the students' perspective, and it's so enriching to actually hear what's being done and not just the theory. So thank you, all of you, for sharing your practices and your experiences. And I would like to stay with that reflection to see what works. and not just what doesn't work in the traditional system. Because we've been questioning and criticizing the traditional system from a political and from an academic perspective for more than 50 years. And I would like personally to stop questioning and to start seeing what actually works and how we can do it relationally.
Great. Thank you, Tamara. That's a really beautiful reflection and beautiful ideas. Thank you. Luke, can I invite you to give
Thank
your
you,
reflections?
Sheila. Well, I can follow the words from Tamara, so I will want to repeat them. This is a great conference. It shows it's already possible to establish these relational processes into our institutes. So I met many people, spoke to people from India, people from China, people from Greece. I think that's so great with these online opportunities. And what I think is that it realized again that it's so easy to get into relation again, only by using this online, this technology to do so. So I was thinking when I was listening to all these activities the last 3 days, I was thinking, what does this bring for our teacher training institutes? That's partly my job. And I realized that when Ken is talking about working on relations, or the other thing is the distinction in working on relational processes, then I think there's a lot of work still to be done in teacher training institutes. So I realized that there would be enormous chance to get this idea of relational work into the teacher training institutes, to work with young student teachers together, because they are our future of these change we need in educational institutes, and they will affect their children in their classrooms with this idea of we are all one family, and together we can solve any problem which will come to us. So I think it made me clear that there is a huge opportunity to use these teacher training institutes. And as Pelvi was talking about, these institutes and nations which are working separately from each other, also there's a second chance to work more together within different nations or different institutes. Perhaps the last one I want to add is that, well, when you look at all these marvelous examples in this conference, I realized, wow, we couldn't perhaps think these are just a few hundreds of examples. So it's like a needle in a haystack. But I know there is a big and huge silent movement which is not shown and doesn't know Tao's institutes who are working in the same way. So I think there's also an opportunity to get connected, to get into relation with all these people who are already also doing this. So I'm very hopeful for this. Thank you.
It's good to be hopeful.
Yeah, well, we need to be hopeful, I think. That's the only survival, I guess.
Yes, right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Thalia. You're muted.
All along, I couldn't stop thinking, Gregory Bateson's famous phrase, the pattern which connects. And Bateson, who influenced me so much when I was young, he was my very first contact with this kind of thinking, who was a pioneer in teaching us how to connect the dots, and that relations are the essence of the living world. So, and he used to say that the royal way to understanding relationships is stories. So I think that that's what has been happening these past 3 days. Dots were connected and stories were shared in a relational process with people that may have known each other, but people that they didn't know each other also as well. And they got here for the first time to explore education as relating. So I felt it was an amazing exchange across continents, across cultures, across time zones, and all wondering the same questions as Pedagogy Torsi said the first day. And what was really amazing was, I think, the warmth we all felt, the sharing, the inspiring ideas that flowed in a very harmonious way, thanks to the way the conference was organized, despite the limitations of the online. You know, I didn't really, the limitations of the online didn't bother me at all. I felt that actually our world was made smaller, you know, with all these contexts from all over the world. My second point is that the political was the visible and the invisible thread that tied presentations together, from the comments voiced the first day in the first panel, from the work Taos, Portugal and Spain are doing, to the sessions discussing decolonization of the curriculum or critical relationality, or those discussing pedagogy or school management. The message was something that has been said and repeated, but I will repeat it once more. The message was that the paradigm of competition, of the educational system as an enterprise, of knowledge as profit-making commodity, of surveillance, of measurement, all reinforce power structures. And we held that everywhere. We heard that from the students this morning as well. Power structures that work against the notion of co-creation, of the holistic approach to knowledge, of community, against practices that are dialogic and collaborative, against values that are values such as equality, justice, inclusion, and decision-making emerging from the relational process, and against the notion of process versus an output, you know, all focus on the output. And as Ella said this morning, processes, power structures that try to fit someone into somebody else's model. So I think this realization at certain points in the conference made me, and I think made others also, very pessimistic, because they bring pessimistic thoughts. And what we have been doing here is to highlight that a different kind of education is possible, that a different kind of school can be done, that different policies are indeed taking place in some places in the world, in a smaller way or in a bigger way. And I think that this has been, in a way, a big transition. I was in one of the sessions, which was that I participated on inclusive systemic dialogue facilitated by Janelle Naudet in South Africa, that I didn't know. It was interesting how we actually phrased that from desperation to hope. So as Luke as well ended his comment with hope, so I leave it with hope as well.
Okay, that's a good theme for us, I think. Sally Howe, your reflections.
Well, I'll start with hope.
Okay.
I heard Connor say conversations matter. Let's just talk. Let's have a conversation this morning. Ella said having relationship transform learning. And Felix on the first day of the posting on the JAM board said, how might we shift from ecosystem to ecosystem? Echoing, Thalia, your words of Bateson. And I think for me, that's been the highlight. Like, we have been performing and playing the discursive in these 3 days. And this is like a microcosm of what my hope is that we continue doing in the spaces we are in. And bring it into the spaces, that nation state spaces where walls are thrown up. And that was what was kind of like a takeaway for me in that high level. Like, there's relational practice in the everyday encounters here, but how do we also have that feeling at that level, especially with the climate summit going on right now? How do we have the echo of that? What's an educational summit in that way? Or is the climate summit the educational summit? Like, do they need to be separate spaces or not? And that kind of questioning that I experienced, and in the ways that people were merging art with inquiry, bringing in politics with education, bringing in the interplay of, I think Greg and Ardella were talking about critical conscious leadership, like really questioning what's the change work. All of that in terms of education's relating, coming back to this idea of how do we stay oriented to the process of relationships and conversations? How do we continue to have faith in it when, kind of what you're saying, Talia, that the emphasis comes back on what's your strategic plan and what's the goal and where are we headed, or assessment or testing in the micro or the macro system that we're talking about. So I think for me, that's the hope, which is, I think, what Harleen Anderson talks about, conversations and relationships go hand in hand. So yeah.
Great. Those are great reflections. I feel like I've missed a lot. So let me ask you each now to tell me and share with all of us what inspired you, and what are the new ideas that you're holding now, and what kind of support will we all need to move these new ideas, the things that are inspiring you forward, to not succumb to that overwhelming feeling of, fighting a dinosaur, which is the tradition of education. Because as you have all highlighted, there's so much happening that is such a contrast to the tradition of education. So what are your inspirations from this gathering? What new ideas? How do we work together to make this happen? Tamara, I'll start with you again.
Okay, so I've been thinking about something very simple. That is that I believe that working from a relational approach is just to be present and to go step by step, just recognizing the human being that you have in front. That will be a teacher, a student, a parent, or a consultant, whoever you are working with, to see him, her, they, I don't know, the new articles, but to see them as a human being. So I feel like going back to the basics and connecting in a relationship-based approach is to see the other as a human, to relate. And what I'm fearful of when I'm thinking about going back to the policies and bringing this relationship-based approach to the bigger sphere is that once you grow, it's harder, like once it gets bigger, it's harder to connect in a meaningful way with too many people. So maybe we need a lot of representation, like ambassadors of these ideas, so that each one can at least connect in a meaningful way with maybe 50 people. I don't know if it's possible to connect with more, but yeah, I was thinking about that it's not just about practicing it, but to create ambassadors that could all connect.
So this idea of ambassadors that you're proposing is sort of the kind of support and collaboration that's necessary to move forward.
Yeah, and to make it a reality.
Yeah.
And also, when I think about policy making or policies in general, many times it stays in a beautiful discourse, and it's really hard to bring it to action and to bring it to the practice. Yeah. So I haven't finished that idea, but I'm there, like, I feel like we stay in the discourse, and I would like to take the next step.
I would like to follow this, Sheila.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Please.
because I like your idea, Tamara, just to keep it simple and to start what I always tell with the first person you meet. You know, you can be the model of the change you want to be. So this relational way of being, I think modeling in our own working places can make that some people get more curious about this. That's what happened in my institute. So my idea would be creating ambassadors, not by convincing to be ambassadors, but to make them curious. And in my institute, I see that this is slowly growing and growing. And the next step, Tamara, what I would suggest is finding key persons in your institutes, in our working place, who is curious, who is open for this. What I experienced the last month is that one person can be curious and he can bring another person to be curious, and then they affect each other in a way. And then suddenly they will ask, tell me more about this. Can we do this? The third one, what I'm doing in my institute is every process where there is an opportunity to do it in relational ways, we do it in relational ways. So I'm always inviting the whole community, although I know they are very busy, but I keep on inviting them. So that could help this idea of ambassadors to make it grow, find positive key persons, and then slowly this field will growing, I guess. Mm-hmm.
I like that. And how do you recognize curiosity? Like, how do you?
Very easy. Yes, very easy. I think well, you can look in the eyes of people when they are more glancing, when people are questioning you, you know, when people are coming with their own ideas. What I experience in my process is that it's very important also to connect with the dominant people who have not yet these ideas, not to alien them, but to invite them. Let's eat together, let's have a lunch or whatever. And then suddenly, again, I notice in my institute that suddenly these dominant people who sometimes are blocking these ideas suddenly become a little bit more open, not by telling them what you do is wrong, but by appreciating that we need both ways of doing. And then suddenly there is this collaboration between people. That's what I experienced in my institute.
That goes back to Tamara, what you said in the very opening, your opening comments. Enough critique, let's do. Yeah, we don't have to say what's wrong with the current system. So
yes, and often we think that we have to wait for the system to change. But my motto is now we cannot wait for the system. We can change tomorrow with the first person you meet.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I would build on that, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes the stuckness comes because of that obstacle, but I think a process orientation, like a relational orientation, can take on so many forms of engagement.
Yeah,
I agree.
And I think trying to envision, and that was what was inspiring for me, the ways in which people were talking about that engagement in macro and interpersonal microsystems, that it gives me hope, because then I know you're doing that work, this larger systems work, and I can do the school inclusive, how to have difficult conversations in the classroom, right? That's what I mean by inclusive pedagogy. But it's both in preparation for life and its content in my view. But then when I go into my institution, which goes back to what I think you opened up with, Sheila, they're preparing them for the workforce, right? Their ideas about counting how many students got jobs. And so what gets taught, which courses, which programs, how they get designed is all a measurement in terms of jobs. And there is not this measurement in terms of wellness, in terms of relating, and this idea of what are we creating together. And so I found myself in meetings, because I'm also chairing committees, I'm also on committees, when that idea comes up from whoever it is, right? It could be from their marketing head, or it could be from the vice president or whatever. I just bring in these ideas and introduce, well, there are different measures. There's the economic measures and there's the well-being measures. And what do you think are the well-being measures here? And I just leave it as a question of curiosity, Tamara, that leaves them But sometimes I find myself wanting to explain it and having to hold that, let the question be the leader by which that person gets engaged rather than the telling of it, if that makes sense.
Great.
Yeah, I think that, what Saliha said, that's what also was so good to me at the conference, that you could see the different levels, you could hear all those discourses, and you would see all those practices. Might they be in the university, in the school, the parents, the students, and we rarely have this kind of exchange, which is so multi-level. And the bigger system, the smaller system, the everyday management in the school. And I think that that's what was something that really was so good in this conference. And we shouldn't let this die. I mean, there was a dynamic, there was a momentum that was created. And I think that connections were made. And I think that now we need a second step. We need something that would be something that could be organized from the Tao's side, but also smaller efforts that can be connections on the people we met, on the ideas we shared, new people. Richard was saying the other day, Richard de la Cuadra was saying that I have invited so many people in this conference that had nothing to do with Tao's before. So, to preach to the converted, it's easy. But now bringing in,
हमारे
can
वाले
you
टीचर एक ग्रुप में पहुंच गए
can you
और अपने
make it
गाने
mute?
चालू करे भगनी
Hearing beautiful Indian sounds.
कहानी सुना रही थी वहाँ पे ये कहानी हमारे बचपन से लेकर बुढ़ापे
Okay.
Okay, go on, Talia.
So Richard was saying the other day that I've asked so many people in this conference, and new people that they didn't know Taos. So to talk to the Taos people, we all are like-minded, but suddenly other like-minded people come into the picture that are not part of the gang, and these new people are really ambassadors, and we can connect with the new people and they can connect with us, and we have to take this forward. I think there are pending needs, and pending needs that would move us towards hope and leave back the desperation we feel, as you say, in your committees that are looking towards a different model, our universities that the only thing they want is to advertise in what position your university has moved on. So how many dissertations, how many PhDs, so this moves you on. And this seems to be the greatest concern of the university. But at the same time, there's so many people that need something else and they do something else. And this has to come to light. This has to be, we need more connections. We need to broaden the pattern which connects.
Well, I think we need to broaden our own social construct of Taos then, because very easily we can stay in our family, the Taos family. So I think what you suggest, Talia, to break it open is very important, I think. And what I said in my beginning reflection, I'm sure that there are thousands and thousands of examples outside of Taos which resonates with what we are talking about. So it's only that we use perhaps these Taos words, language, which they don't use. So I think that's very hopeful. Again, when we use the word hopeful. Yeah. Great.
Sorry, were you finished, Loki?
No.
Yeah. Which brings me to a question to what you both are saying, which is language can be barriers sometimes. It can also connect, right? But if we orient to relationships, and I'm not questioning the orientation to relationships, but if we orient to relationships, then we only find those that we connect to. So how do we reach out to those that we are not in relationship? That's my one question. And the other one is, Talia, as when you talk about those needs and as people are doing the projects, and I think Marie this morning was kind of hinting at it when she was asking, I think, Connor about what kind of funding does the school have? Like some people can coalesce and form groups, and that keeps it at one level in the way Tamara's saying it keeps it small. But if you want to start going big, then this question of money comes in and funding comes in and what matters comes in. So my question is, how do we do this in a way that's, if economics is organizing our life, how do we break through economics to form and find those relationships and not be tied down in our organizing by money, I guess?
It's not always easy, but there are ways to bypass systems, right? I mean, there are ways that you can go by the system and bypass it at the same time. Because if you look at funding, for example, funding of projects, funding of research, they have their own rules and the way to do it. But within this framework, there's always leeway of moving things forward in a different way. Nobody questions you when you do that.
It also questions me what you're talking about, because sometimes we think that we need funding to work in relational ways. So when I'm working in South America and we have no money, then I can say, well, perhaps we don't need money at the first place. We just need to be in a different way in coming into relations. So that doesn't cost any money. We need to talk differently with each other. So it can also be such an obstacle that we think, let's wait for the money and then we can change the big institutes. Of course, we need sometimes money to do things, but let that not be the main thing.
You know, somebody used yesterday Martin Luther's words, the time is always right to do what is right. And I think this is, that's it. It's always right to do what is right. The time is always
As
right.
I listen to all of you, what I'm thinking is there are many threads that you're all pulling. And one of them is, in my words, would be, we're not talking about an idea or a theory or a strategy here. We're talking about a way of being in the world. And that way of being in the world is to be with others. It is this humanizing quality to be curious about each other. And it's unfortunate that this is not our knee-jerk way of being in the world for many people. Another thread is, how do we break out of our bubble and introduce this? And Sally, how you were talking about being in administrative meetings and so forth. And in all my years in academia, when I was asked to take on some, administrative task or join some committee, my question to myself was, how much leverage will I have to use this as a little laboratory for myself to see if, kind of raising curiosity, raising questions about how we can practice in a relational way and put that financial piece aside, always. And actually, so we have all these little laboratories that we all are operating in, and they aren't in the bubble of the Taos Institute. And that's the way, I think that's the way forward. I mean, that we're all doing it and we can continue doing it. And it doesn't need to be under the guise of, here's a whole new plan, let's wipe out the bad and bring in the good, because that is just more of the same old divisive kind of conversation.
But I think the Taos needs to prompt further the work that we started. I mean, we are all engaged in our own worlds and our own communities, and we carry them forward. But I think Taos started something very precious for education with this conference, and I think that Taos needs to continue that.
I may regret saying this because it'll be on me, but my image is that this gathering in these 3 days is just a beginning, and that instead of waiting a year, that every couple of months there's a topical offering that people can just join in. It doesn't have to be so organized as a conference, but as a conversation space to keep the conversation going around a variety, around curriculum or administration or training educators. You know, we could pick different topics, the connection between politics and education and so forth.
Yeah, perhaps another thing I want to bring in is from the European. Sorry? Yeah.
I see Tamara has been trying to come in. So if
That's fine.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was so sure I saw you come and go 2 times.
Yeah, but then I forget what I wanted to say. But one idea that is coming to my mind is that I wouldn't see the economy or the market as the enemy, because it's part of the world we live in.
Yeah.
And training or educating for the market or training students to get a job, well, is the world that we live in. I don't think that's the enemy or the problem. Because also our organizations are changing.
Yeah.
Like what it meant to have a job 50 years ago, it's not the same that it is today. And the work style and how we live our lives, it's changing. So maybe it's more about connecting to the market and connecting to the enterprises and businesses instead of seeing them as something that we don't want in the education sphere or in the education world. And maybe they also want a relational approach. I don't know. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point to raise. I mean, we accept the reality that we live in, which is the reality of an economic system that has a big say in everything that happens. So how do we connect in that way?
Yeah, it has things that don't work, but things that work pretty well. So maybe we can help to develop a better economic system through education.
Luke?
Well, I just wanted to add another thing, is that from the European view, like me living in the Netherlands, there's less written in Dutch about this relational important work like social construction and so on. So we always have to read English written literature, articles, you know, like this conference. And for some people in the Netherlands, the Dutch teachers, it could be more difficult to engage. So my dream would also be to have more in our own languages written, or with video clips or whatever. No, it could make it more accessible for people with the English speaking people. Mm-hmm.
You know what that means for you, Luke.
Well, I saw some Dutch people on the conference, so perhaps they can help there. Yeah.
Can we take a question? I see Patrick has his hand up. You open for that? Okay, Patrick.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. I would put in the chat, but I wasn't sure that it was going to come out my fingers as easily as it might come out my mouth. So I came to this group by way of Pam Brett McLean from the University of Alberta. So I'm not an academic. I'm staff. I'm a designer professionally, and this year a close friend of mine and of Pam's, Michael Frost, came with us too, and Michael's a community member at large. What my dream or my wish, to answer the question that has been evolving in this conversation, would be to be able to take some of the struggles that we have as practitioners, and I recognize the false dichotomy there, to members of this community and say, these are things we're struggling with, be able to throw out problems that are problems of the everyday that we're focusing. So I'll tell you what's happening in our context related to education. At the University of Alberta, we have suffered devastating budget cuts. They're unprecedented in the history of our province, and we've taken on more than any other university in our province. And so that's threatened my job and the jobs of colleagues. Mm-hmm. I've become quite involved in the union. Most of all, I think it's important to articulate forcefully, eloquently, what we're losing with these cuts. So many of you have developed language that give us a means to address these things. I'm so grateful to Ken for the book Relational Being that I read years ago, and it gave me language I didn't have to point to things. So that's my request, is to say, I would like to come to you with these, problems of the quotidian and say, these are the things we're facing, and share them in a forum and say, this is what I'm struggling with expressing. I'd like to point to, and also connect these themes that we're hearing. It's not just in Alberta that this is happening, but elsewhere, to shine a light on it broadly. I think this group is incredible, and I'm so grateful for being welcomed in so warmly, to have never been made feel from the beginning. I felt like I mattered here. It didn't matter that I didn't have an academic position. I was standing humbly beside these people whose names were so big and they were so warm and generous. That's the strength of this community, that I or Michael could come to you and say, we have a feeling, but we don't know how to talk about this.
Thank you, Patrick. And that's a litmus test, I suppose, that members of the Taos community actually embody these ideas.
And if I can say to that, I think it speaks to the participants here.
Yeah.
I think we create conditions, if this is a learning lab in itself, but what each one of us brought in that culture, and thanks to Don and Alex for holding that space in technology and all the other ways that you put it into the design by the organizing committee. So there was a practice of conversation, there was a practice of relating, but there was also the showing upness on behalf of the participants. And I want to just add to that piece that you're speaking to, Patrick. I think you're speaking to a very important piece. One is to come and connect and kind of share ideas with each other and how we can hold and support, which is how to go forward, Talia, one way, right? But the other, I think you're saying, is how to connect the dots with other, both systems and other places. And I think it's so important because sometimes we can reduce relationality to the people, to those two people. And in talking about humanizing, we're not talking about humanizing systems, we're talking about and it is what people do together and what they're doing makes, but we have to not forget that the doing takes on a larger life of its own. And so I really, sometimes I'm like thinking when we speak about this, I'm shifting it a little bit to speak to this notion of how do we stay oriented to the systems that are coming into being that's more felt, that there's a value there that's more felt that we don't have language for.
Yeah.
And even as Patrick comes here to define language, how do we also take that step to create language and make that step as the step of the system rather than, if that makes sense what I'm saying, that we have to go back and forth in creating language too. So just want to throw that out.
I just want to add, this probably maybe doesn't need to be said, but back to the opening plenary, I think so important for us and embedded in what you said, Saliha, is this isn't about relationships, it's about relational processes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's so critical because, relationships are great, but it's this process of being open to diversity, difference, multiplicity, being curious and resisting. I mean, it's not all about happy stuff. It's, being able to resist ideas, but not just for the point of critique or resistance, but for the point of reconstructing or deconstructing something and then reconstructing again.
And it's also
I don't know
about
if you want to take any more comments. There's a couple more hands up. If we can do this for a couple minutes, maybe a couple minutes more.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, great.
With the time, it'll be great.
Tamara, did you quickly want to say something before we take another question?
Yeah, that I love the idea of this being a learning lab that Saliha said, because it's about experience, and sometimes it's really hard to teach to be relational or to learn like in a formal way, but it's about having the experience and then pass it up as an experience. Like once you live it, it's easier to kind of do it for others or put the space for others.
Wow. Carrie, hi Carrie.
Sheila, nice to see you.
You too.
of course, I've now been listening for 5 minutes since I raised my hand, so I got 10,000 other thoughts in there. But thank you for this conversation. And I was thinking, actually, I wrote this in the chat. So I was thinking back to something you said at the beginning, Sheila, and then to kind of a really interesting, I think, back and forth that has happened in this conversation, or is, to me, I hear, which was you talked about how do we take these individual amazing projects, the hundreds of them that we see here and what we assume are then the thousands of them, and transform education. And I think that's such an, I was thinking about the role Taos has played in the decades that I've known it, and also the role that the Eastside Institute plays where I work. And in some ways, freeing itself from that responsibility in a certain way, saying we're going to create something independent of the institutionality of the university. Because in creating something independent, we create the possibility of making discoveries and going somewhere new, not because we think it's going to transform the university, which has centuries and centuries, as we know, of institutionality, but because we need alternatives. We need, in their practice, their practical critical critique, right? In practice, they're a critique of those institutions. And so I was thinking in this conversation, I kept hearing the back and forth between hope and despair, both in using those words, but also in continuously coming back to what about the funding? What about the ways we can't do X? What about the, and I think my dream is that I work in a university and I work in a completely independent organization that doesn't take funding from universities, and that's where the creativity lives for me. It's not in thinking that I'm going to be able to do what I can do with the international class at the Eastside Institute in my classroom at Rutgers. It's that I can do what I do at Rutgers as well as I do it, as creatively I do it, because I am creating something that I believe is in itself a critique of that institutionality. So I just wanted to give all of you, because that's my experience of your work. And I think when we start thinking, why isn't it impacting, we're at best being naive. And I think we don't have to go there so quickly. There's so much work to do to create the alternatives that in themselves, as they grow bigger, hopefully ordinary people, teachers will point to them and say, I want that. Why am I doing this when I could be doing that? That to me is the power of what we've all been doing these last few days. And it gives me great hope. It doesn't eliminate the despair because we're not superpowers, but it's not causal for me. So I just wanted to give you that and see what other people thought, what that experience is for others.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I completely agree. I mean, we have parallel lives in that regard because, my time at the university has been inspired by what I've been able to do with the Taos Institute. And for me personally, the classroom, anything's possible. And I know that I have colleagues that think that there are shoulds and musts that bind them. And so the more we can play in these alternative spaces, then that bleeds over into these institutionalized spaces, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we take Marge's question? Hello, Marge. You're muted.
I want to go back to what Sally Haas said, because that seems to me where we're at now, which is connecting the dots. And the notion of relational exchange is really hitting me very hard lately, because those of you who spoke about the economics of the university and the imperative to measure in quantifiable non-relational ways. That's the water all we fishes swim in that same water. A very tiny thing happened that I feel good about. The group of people I worked with did a guidebook on collecting stories during the time of the multiple pandemics. And the first thought was, well, we want to give it away. It's a free guide. And then the second thought was, no, wait a minute. What we want is a relational exchange. So this idea of, can we give you this and can we get from you connecting the dots with you? So I want to push that, that term relational exchange because it has a lot of meaning to me today.
Thanks, Marge. Thank you. Dawn, how are we doing on time?
I'd like us to wrap up. I guess I have a question. I originally wanted to give everyone one more small group time to reflect on a couple questions. The question would be, what was most enlivening? What was the most enlivening takeaway for you? What is your dream of relating, education as relating, and your wish for the future, kind of like what the panel has just been talking about? And then what small step or large step or action can you take to bring relational practices in education forward? So if people have some energy around that, we can spend 20 minutes with that in small groups. And then I'd really like to all come back and have a closing comment from Ken Gergen. So are we up for that, everybody? Does that sound good?
Good.
All right. So Sheila, any closing comments then from you, or shall we move into small groups?
Yeah, I would just say thank you to the four of you, and so much more to be said. And so obviously this conversation must continue and we need to keep going. But thank you. And also I learned from what I missed in not being able to be present these past days from you. So thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your reflecting here. And I really hope people stay on. I see people are already jumping off, but I'd like us to, if we can stay on and then end together with Ken doing some final thoughts, that would be just really great way to close out our 3-day program. So
No,
Alex,
we will end with bring your own beverage tonight. That's
yes,
the end.
then there's a bring your own beverage cafe right at the end. So another informal conversation. Perfect. We'll move into that then finally. And then Alex, are we ready to do small groups just for, maybe 15 or 20 minutes? So we won't keep it real long.
Yes, we're ready.
And so I put the questions in the chat. I can put them in the chat again, just so you have them right handy. Just a highlight, what are you taking away, your dreams, and what small step can you take, or a large step can you take to bring these ideas forward?
Thank you.
So, yeah, welcome back everyone from your small group time. We are coming to our close here, and we just have so much gratitude for all of you for being here and participating. I know that many of you know Ken Gergen, and some of you may not, but I'd like to bring Ken on to, I'm going to spotlight Ken and invite him to just have a few closing words for us. He was part of the opening plenary. Ken is one of the co-founders and president of the Taos Institute. Many of you were writing me throughout the 3 days that you've done a lot of work with Ken's writing, and you've included it in your research and dissertation. So Ken is one of our inspirations for a lot of these ideas and practices. And Ken, I just welcome you to say a few thoughts and closing comments here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dawn. Actually, I feel it's sort of inappropriate for me to be speaking here. Conceptually and ideologically, there shouldn't be a white male with a final voice. Dawn has been prodding me in part because we had problems with the opening ceremony in which I lost my video. And this has cost me some more money to replace it, but at least I'm here and I hope it doesn't shut off. There are other ways in which I wasn't certain I could add anything to this fantastic array of presentations and discussions. It's been one day after another of enormous learning experience. And are there any words left? Anything left to say that hasn't already been part of what we've done? And I thought, well, there is one piece that I felt that might add something to this last session. And I guess the issue is one of hope, and one of the enormous sort of ideals that we represent. That is, as Sheila and others in the last panel spoke about, we're not just talking about schools and measurement and classes and so on. We're talking about ways of life here, ultimately, even though not stated boldly. I think they're implicit. And I don't want to specify it. I do think relational process is one way of understanding, but perhaps not the only one. And speak to the hope of that, because in some sense it seems, well, what are we up to? I mean, who are we, this little band of rebels trying to change the world? I don't think that's what it's about. I think there's incredible hope there. And I just want to speak to that for a few minutes. Because when you ask yourself, what is this conference all about in a way? What brings us, most of whom are not part of the Taos Institute, from multiple countries around the world? We didn't really plan for that. It just emerged, where we thought, well, perhaps we'll have 30, 40 presentations. There are over 130 requests presentation time from 20 countries, people here from 30 countries. What is that? One has got to feel that there's some kind of sea change taking place culturally, perhaps globally, and that we come together strangely out of these various sundry places in the world because we're part of that. We feel it, it resonates in what we do. And we're doing these things not because they're just niceties. We're doing them largely because it makes sense to us in some deep way to be doing this and to make our way here and to be patient with each other and cross these boundaries. This in itself, to me, is a first sign of a sea change. And it's there, to me, also represented in the youth. What's going on in Glasgow today in terms of thousands of youth gathered from around the world to protest lack of climate accord. It's there in Harvard Business School when a whole group of students don't want to buy the traditional ways of doing business. It's there in the Agency of World Benefit, which businesses are getting together to try to decide how they can benefit the world in place of exploiting it. So it's there. I also want to say that one of the promises to me is, and I've heard it in a lot of what's going on here, is in the fact that classrooms are changing themselves, that what we're exposed to increasingly are variegated, highly variegated classes, not only in terms of immigrants who become to dominate, not only in terms of minority groups, not only, but also in terms of the ways in which students come in with multiple interests, already kindled, enthusiasms, seas of knowledge that teachers have no idea about, and they're making their own demands. It's like increasingly difficult to standardize those classes, to teach the same thing to all and expect all are going to learn it in the same way. It's complicated and it's demanding, and teachers struggle with it. Schools struggle with it. It's as if we have classes now where everybody's special needs student, just in a different way. And we realize that somehow that system of standardization and measurement, putting everybody on one continuum, just does not make sense anymore. So that's promising to me. It's like a bottom-up change coming from youth, coming from the nature of our classes. I also think that the last session, for example, mentioned what I'll call the luminosities, or the fact that we're all ambassadors in some sense with what we're doing locally. And as we share the enthusiasm that will be created, the sense of, God, I'd like to do that too, will be there too. But what's happened now is that these are beginning in some places to reach a national level. Some of them are so powerful that now they catch the attention of government. And I think not only of Ingeborg School in the Netherlands, but here in the United States, high-tech high system where there are no grades and it's all pretty much all practice-based learning. And it's perhaps the biggest thing in education that's happened, and that's now caught the attention of national level. So these are not small incidents. You can feel the momentum gathering there. Also, the fact that some of these have reached actual decision-making bodies in governments, that the kinds of discussions that we're having here have reached government proportions, not only in Finland, as we learned the first day, but they are now with a new Minister of Education in Norway who comes out of one of these schools. It's there in Denmark where they're arguing about the nature of exams and whether this is viable. And even in China, this discussion has reached the national level. So again, we're not alone. We have a lot of comrades around the world. I also think that, again, the sea change does not only include education, because of working in other areas, for example, in government, there are multiple attempts now to generate alternatives to top-down governance. And they're coming from countries around the world. Well, collaborative governance, co-governance, relational governance. Journals are filled with these. There are other meetings going on just like ours in all parts of the world, attempting to say, we've got to break down the barrier between the government and the people. That's got to be a relational process. We're all working together. That to me is heartening. Much the same is happening in economics. And here again, we go to the fact that what we're doing in education is not unrelated to the economic system. And so long as we have international or global capitalism and exploitation, and that's our dominant theme, and so long as we have nations working against each other, companies working against each other, probably this will not amount to a lot, that's breaking down. Again, experiments in alternative economics, ways of thinking about economics which don't rely on the old model. So that to me is heartening as well. And perhaps finally, just the fact that we have finally reached a point in human history in which, in fact, if we are not together, if we don't break out of the distinctions, that climate's going to kill us, because that's the way we've treated climate too. It too is part of the relational process, and we and our world has all got to be part of that process, and we've got to pay attention to how that works to generate the ways in which that process can allow us to prosper, to care. So I'm heartened by this conference, and I'm going to naively press forward, and I hope we'll all be together in this. So thank you, Dawn. One last word. I've got to add this, all right? And that is appreciation. I mean, if anybody should be giving a last word, it's Dawn Dole. I can't tell you the amount of work this has been for her. Been overwhelming, like nothing the Taos Institute has ever done before. The complexities of handling 300-400 applications of the technologies, how to bring it together. And to be sure, I think everyone here has had a part in making that success. As no one can say anything unless there's an audience. No one can be the patience that's been shown, the way in which you've come out and leapt the hurdles. It's been glorious. But Dawn has borne the brunt of this week after week after week. Alex Arnold, her companion in all of this, has been just incredible help, as you've all seen every day of this conference. But I wish, I don't know how, because I'm technologically incapacitated to put that heart up on the side that people can do. But if I could do that, I would. Dawn, we owe you an incredible debt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate you being here and just reflecting with us. I appreciate every person that registered for the conference, that put in a proposal, that is just joining us from around the world. We could not have done this without everyone, every single person, and our students that joined in, and just so delighted to have all of this. And I want to say one more, well, actually several more thank yous, but I want to acknowledge and maybe have a couple seconds of just silence for our dear friend and colleague, Mary Gergen. Mary Gergen was Ken's wife. She died a year ago. And she was always the first person on the Taos Institute board to say, let's do a conference. Let's do a conference on this, or let's gather around this idea. And she was always the one that was so enthusiastic, wanting to be on the planning team for every conference. And her emphasis was always around how can we create a space that's warm and welcoming for everyone. So I have to tell you, there were nights this past couple weeks and just finishing up all the details where I would be dreaming and Mary Gergen would come into my dream and just kind of guide me. And I just really, really appreciate Mary's presence in all of this. So thank you for that. And then thank you for all of our panelists and all the presenters and dialogue hosts and our supporting organizations that helped, just helped us really get the word out and spread these ideas. To all of those who made donations to the scholarship fund to make it possible for people to join in. And especially to our planning team who gave hours and hours of time and energy to really look through everything and help create the design. And then finally, again, to all of you for being here. And Alex, thank you for being a collaborating partner in all of this. Really, really great. So this is not the end. We will continue on. And as I said, the website is open for all of you, and we will be sending out a couple emails as follow-up and asking for more ideas. And, I just really hope that you've made connections here in the last 3 days that will last a lifetime. That's what happens at Taos conferences. So feel free to continue to reach out to each other and make those connections. So without further ado, thank you all.
Thank you.